Wind slid like a knife along the top of the wall and worried the stones of the Nightfort as if the castle were a wounded beast and the cold meant to nose its way inside. Jon Snow stood on the rime-slick walkway with Ghost pressed white and silent to his knee. The direwolf's breath plumed, a pale ghost of smoke that was swallowed by the higher dark. The world on either side lay punished and still. South, the vast black tangle of the haunted forest and the long meadows of the new gift, crosshatched with drifts. North, an endless pale that took the starlight as if it were its own. The Nightfort had always been a seam in the world, a place where stories stained the stones. Jon could feel the weight of them under his boots. The old stories were stubborn here. He could have almost put a hand out and touched the shadow moving under the high buttresses, called a name and had it answer. The Night's King had ruled from this place, the cooks whispered, and the rat cook had served a prince baked into a pie and had been cursed not for murder but for the breaking of guest right. The black well in the kitchens did not go down to water, they said, but to the heart of the earth. And beneath it all, beneath ruined towers and wormy galleries, a hidden door of living would listen with a dead man's patience for words that bound ice and men alike. He had not chosen it for its stories. He had chosen it because it was old, and because it stood at the midpoint of a border that had been awound. The Night's Watch had once been strong enough to cradle this monster of a keep. Now the watch was thin as the wind and more uncertain. He had chosen it because the North needed something older than hate to sit under, and the free folk needed a roof that said they were not guesting in their own land. "You look like a man about to build a chimney to the clouds," Tormund Giantsbane rumbled behind him. Jon had heard the crunch of boots before he heard the voice. Giant or no, Tormund moved like a bear in deep snow, noisy and not bothering to be otherwise. "And you look cold, you crow. You are never so solemn as when you're freezing your stones off." Jon turned, mouth-tugging. "You called me here, and here I am. I called you to the Nightfort to stop it swallowing children," Tormund said, eyes crinkling with the humor that sat in him like a cask of good beer. "A place with a story for every stone and hallways that curl you back to your own footprints if you're not careful. Sharp-witted folk know that means leave it be. Sharp-witted folk also know a hall is what we make of it. It's a roof over the cold. It's shelter on both sides of the wall." Jon looked along the broken battlements to where a tumble of frost-shrouded masonry marked a fallen tower. "It can be more than stories. It can be a seat." "Of what?" Tormund scratched his beard.
Champion?
"Curses. Of peace." The word seemed laughable on this height, with moonlight kiting over ice. It was softer than the wind could bear. He said it anyway. "A place for your people to come to speak and mine. A place to be heard, not knifed. A place where the old laws are stronger than winter." The big man's laughter came out in a gust and went skittering along the wall. "Kneelers and free folk, speaking in turns like courtly lords. There's a tale to make a belly ache. We do not kneel, Jon Snow. You need not, nor do the North need to forget who they are. The wall divides us. It needn't sever us. If there's to be trade, marriage, help when the snows come heavy, we need a place that isn't one camp or the other. The Nightfort is neither. The watch held it. Let it stand between. You would put a castle between us and call it a bridge. Someone must." Tormund's mirth settled. He came to lean on the parapet with a groan that could have come from the stones themselves. Below them, the Nightfort lay in nicks and gouges, black mouths where towers had been. The great kitchens crouched like a toad, windowless and thick. All around was the white of new snow over the black of old ruin. "You are stubborn as a tree root," Tormund said at last, "and I've seen you make a bridge of less. Trees hold snow on their branches. We'll do the same. I've sent ravens south. The lords of the north will come and listen. Some of them," Jon said, thinking of Wyman Manderley's round, rose-cheeked cunning, of Robert Glover, hard and willing, of the Flints, more mountain than man. "You'll bring your own, Magner of then, the Hornfoot elders, whoever will answer to you and not hamstring me. To me? I'm an old man with more stories than fingers. They answer to themselves, Jon Snow." Tormund bumped him with an elbow that would have knocked a lesser man to his knees. "But they will come for curiosity. and for ale if you have any worthy of the name." "I don't," Jon said, mouth beating his mirth into something like breath. "But I know a merman south who can find casks." Tormund's beard hid his grin, but Jon could hear the smile in the weight of his chuckle. "You'll make a cook of mermen. That's a thing to see." The thing to see in the days that followed was work. Men and women came with sledges of timber and iron and bundles of thatch like stolen haystacks. Giants came too, the few who still followed Tormund's jokes and judgments, their hair frosted and their tusks rimming their smiles. They lifted what men could not and laughed when the smaller folk scowled at the ease of it. The Nightfort's broken mouths were stuffed with scaffolding. The old ruin was loud with hammer strokes and curses. Smoke started to push from the kitchens again, thin at first, then thicker as the ovens were coaxed into holding fire and the chimneys scrubbed of nests. Grit-blackened women from White Harbor scrubbed long tables. A spear wife from the Milkwater shoed horses with a hand like a smith's. A boy with ears red as berries took a chisel to ice and bit out the first letters of a new sign. Peace Hall. The letters were uneven and brave. The first to arrive from the south was Glover, riding with frost in his beard and a dozen men behind him. He had the look of a hard hand that still remembered gentleness, but he eyed the giants without any gentleness at all. "You've picked a house with bones," he told Jon in the shadow of the kitchens. "When you stand long enough in one place, the Nightfort tries to chew your boots." "Then we'll keep walking," Jon said. Glover's mouth twitched. "You always did. I've brought masons and a man who knows where the well runs under the kitchens. Gods help him. If the tale of it is true, we'll have to wall it off. Men already won't go near it after dark. It will be walled by stones and by stories. We'll put the biggest cauldron we can find over the well mouth. The rat cook will have to lift a lid if he wants to climb out." Jon said this lightly and then less lightly, because the cold did not deserve to be laughed at every hour. It was not the boy they say he killed that brought the curse. It was the bread and salt broken in scorn. "We'll make a ceremony of hospitality here that no one will mistake. Every man and woman who sits under this roof will take it knowing they are safe." "Safe in the north," Glover said dryly. "A bold promise. Safer than under the open sky and more sure than trusting to a stranger's good nature. I'll let the gods be shouted at if we fail." Glover's eyes flicked to Ghost, who had glided out of a darker doorway with the tread of a phantom and was sniffing at a sack of grain. "You still have the old god's eye on your shoulder. Better a wolf than a smile." The knot of Manderley arrived by sled 24 hours later, behind oxen whose breath made twin plumes bigger and more stately than any lord's words. Wyman Manderley did not come himself. He sent his son Wylus with a quartermaster and 2 cooks, who looked at the Nightfort's ovens as if they had known them since they were girls and the walls had been cleaner. Wylus bowed from the saddle, his cheeks apple red from cold and dress. "Lord Snow," he called, and Jon almost smiled at that. Wylus's voice always sounded as if he were telling a joke that he was sure someone would enjoy. "You have chosen a giant to do your courting for you. White Harbor would have sent a harpist if we'd known you needed to woo stones. Father sends good wishes and casks and 300 weight of salt cod for the winter. It will keep your peace if nothing else will." "Your father's peace comes salted, then." "It comes with a shipwright who took it into his head to see the wall before he dies," Wylus said, swinging down and stamping life back into his feet. "Send him home alive if you can. He claims we might one day put mast and sail on Weaver's Horn itself and ship the Nightfort to sea. If he tries to launch the wall, I'll forbid him bread and salt forever." Spoken like a lord. "I'm not one." Spoken like a man who thinks, then. Behind them, a dozen free folk had jammed themselves against the door lintel of the kitchen, eyes not leaving the pot where a brown stew was finding its temper. Manderley's cooks threw herbs in like oaths. "Bread and salt later." One of them hissed without looking away from the simmer. "There's bread when there is bread. There will be salt enough when I say." There was salt enough and bread enough when the horn was blown. They ate crammed together on benches that had known other backs, and the words said before the first bread was broken were careful and loud with tradition. Manderley's quartermaster inspected the ceremonial salt for purity as if hunting glass splinters. A giant broke his loaf gently, with fingers that could have cracked a man's skull, and handed the crust to a girl with bad boots and eyes too old for her face. She ate with the manner of someone learning to be a guest. It went like that for 2 days. Arrivals, meat, talk that flared and then died like sparks. They spoke of trade, mostly. They were comfortable with trade. Hides and steel, amber and fish, things that came salted or braided with twine. They spoke of marriage too, in the careful way people did when speaking of crossing old lines that had meant safety. We've always stolen. A spear wife with patches of light where her teeth used to be said, not entirely in jest. Stolen a man, stolen a woman, stolen a goat. She scratched her ear with filthy fingers. Kneelers keep a thing locked up unless they want it stolen. Some locks keep wolves out, Wylis said mildly. Some keep lambs in. It matters which you mean. That's a merman answer, Tormund hooted, and some of the wildlings laughed. Others did not. The thens had come late and stony, their Magnar looking around the hall with the inward gaze of someone weighing each stone and finding all things either useful or dead. He had the sort of face that had never laughed in private, much less in a hall with strangers. The Flints came all in furs and suspicion. The Serwins came like men expecting to be robbed. A dozen other small lords arrived with names like old knives, and each looked at the giants as if they were watching the sea stand up and walk. On the 4th day there was a body, because this was the north and because there are always men who think the only way to hold the past is with a blade. They found him in one of the old galleries where the Nightfort had slumped like a drunk and been shored with timbers. He was young, and his hair stuck up as if the wind had never left it alone. Jon knew him. His name was Bannon Crowell, a boy from beyond the Milkwater who had laughed like a fox when ghosts surprised him the first time, and who had made a belt from the skins of rabbits he had taken with snares in the coppice south of the keep. He had no belt now. He had an arrow in his back. They brought him to the hall without thinking. The rules of the hall were for the living, and grief made most rules seem smaller than they were. The cold hadn't touched him yet. His cheeks still held a remnant of the pink that labor lends to youth. The fletching of the arrow was raven-black bound with slivers of bone. The sound went out of the hall like breath from a cut throat. A murmur came on it, sharp as a blade being whetted. The thens surged first because they were proud and saw everything in lines. The Magnar's mouth did not move, but his hand lifted against a chest of one of his men and stopped him as surely as a wall would have. Who? Tormund's voice was small and heavy, a boulder dropped by a child. No one spoke because to speak first is to be marked. Then too many tried, and the hall turned ugly with voices. Someone named the Flints. Someone named the thens themselves, in a tone meant to cut as much as defend. A Serwin leaned forward as if he would spit and withheld it, seeing Jon's eyes. Wylis Manderly looked at the ceiling as if to ask the rafters whether they remembered how men behaved when they forgot to. Jon did not shout. The room would have risen like wolves to a rabbit had he raised his voice. He needed it to move differently. He went to the boy and knelt and put his hand on the black shaft and felt nothing in it but wood and wickedness. "We will not begin with this," he said, not looking up. "We will not begin with blood. Bread and salt were taken in this hall. Whoever broke guest right will be the one trapped by his own choice, not by our haste." He lifted his head, meeting eyes one by one. "No one draws steel under this roof. This is sanctuary. We will take the boy out to the yard and give him the sky and the old trees. We will find who killed him, and then we will bring that man to the weirwood and ask the gods what makes a man right for justice." The hall breathed. Some of it anger, some of it relief, a good deal of it confusion at the notion that justice was something you asked the gods about. The thens yielded the space around the body. Together, with Tormund at one shoulder and Glover at the other, Jon lifted the boy and bore him into the cold. Ghost walked ahead with solemn steps, head low. The direwolf's tail had stilled, a flag at half-mast. They dressed the boy under a maple whose branches held old snow and new. The weirwood, for there was one in the Nightfort's old god's wood, knotted and thick as a fist with blood sap dried in channels from 1,000 winters, watched with its carved, scarred face. Bran had told Jon once, in a voice too old for the boy who had spoken it, that the old trees remembered. Jon believed it now in a way he would not have when he was younger. The face looked tired more than cruel. "Do trees know guessed right?" Tormund muttered to the air, and grunted when no wind answered. "Better than men," Jon said. Behind him, men began to hunt in the way that hunts do when they are pushed by anger rather than hunger. The arrow was the only clue offered. The shaft came from birchwood. The head was nothing but a smooth wedge of iron. The fletching told a story that could have belonged to anyone who had sat a night by a bonfire and fletched by instinct with what was in reach. It told a story of the north and beyond the north, blunt and cruel and unhelpful. Jon asked to see the place the boy had been found. The gallery was a wind trap with a roof. It smelled of old piss and mice. A lintel had cracked and been braced with a timber fixed with iron straps. There was nothing to show where the boy had been shot, only a smear of blood where his face had met the dirt. Ghost ranged ahead and back, nostrils cutting the cold. He looked at Jon once, white head tilted, and slipped into a crawl that was not war but focus. "Do you sense something?" Jon asked softly. Ghost's gaze cut to a crack in the stone where a door had been once, sealed by rubble. The rubble had a new wetness to it. The frost there had been broken and then refrozen. Jon set his glove to the rock and felt the slick. It was nothing. It was only a whisper. He felt it anyway. "Some creature has squeezed through," Glover said, crouching beside him. "A rat, perhaps. The Nightfort breeds a belly of them." "Rats don't smear rubble frost with iron shavings," Jon murmured, lifting his hand to show the cut in his glove where grit had nicked leather and slid a splinter of metal into his palm. He wiped the blood away and pocketed the shard. "Someone's been prizing iron here, and in the cold. Men will cut corners when their fingers want a fire." Glover grunted. "A man in this place can cut a corner and find the end of the world." Slack as this clue was, there were others, too subtle to convince anyone who did not want convincing. Burns on a glove left in a corner suggested a lamp had been snuffed in haste. A scuff on a stair that said man, not mouse. And ghost refusing to go near the old well in the kitchens. In the gloom of that room, the hearth looked like a black mouth in a face that had never smiled. They had cleared it. They had cleaned it. They had hung cauldrons on iron hooks whose ends had been caged in rust and then set free. They had not touched the well. The well sat like a thought men did not want. Its mouth was a circle of stone, slick with old damp and rumor. A chain rose from it on a windlass meant for buckets bigger than a head. "This is where the rat cook fed the king he killed," one of the Manderley cooks said in a tone that suggested she knew the truth of it and that the truth was miserable. "Not in this pot. In his own pride. We do not speak the old tales to freeze our tongues," Jon said. "We speak them to shape our hands. No one drinks from the well. No one did. But someone had lifted the iron lid, and someone had set it down again with a care too sharp to be honest." Jon put the iron back with a ring that made men jump and women hiss like cats. That night he did not sleep in the Lord Commander's old chamber. He slept in a blanket in the hall with everyone else, because the Nightfort ate men alone and because he wanted men with eyes open nearer to where he expected hands to move. He slept with a thin thread of fear in him and a thicker rope of determination. He slept with Ghost's flank pressed to his ribs and felt the direwolf wake twice and stiffen and audit the dark. In the cold hour before dawn, a horn sounded from the west parapets. Jon was on his feet before he knew he'd moved, and there were men around him also rising with oaths that made sense only if you had been born in the cold and learned to curse the way other men learned to pray. Outside, the air bit and then held as if trying to fit men into its mouth. On the parapet, a shadow stood without moving. It was not a wight. It was only a man who had learned to be still. "What is it?" Jon asked, climbing. "Light," the sentry said, voice small with bafflement. "Fire. Out in the trees along the King's Road. For points, maybe 5. Not a force. A hand looking for a lock." "Or a hand returning to a lock," Glover said behind him, squinting. His breath smoked. They watched the lights creep and stop and start again. They watched until they counted fewer lights. Then more. They watched until it was foolish to do so, and still they did. When the lights finally died, Tormund, who had arrived with his hair full of frost, spat. "Foxes," he said. "Men pretending to be foxes," Jon said. "Or men hoping we treat them like ghosts. Either way they know we are watching." He did not call the hall again that morning. He did something else instead, because the Nightfort was old and the old things in this land listened if you whispered in the right ear. He went to the weirwood. In the tree's whitened veins the cold lay like marrow. Its red leaves hung like tongues cut into careful shapes. The face carved there was cracked by a dozen winters and yet whole. Jon stood beneath it and felt the throb of a heart that was not his. He had felt it here before, and he did not know if it was his own stirrings of fear answering his boyhood prayers, or something in the wood that was glad of listeners. He spoke the vows he had taken as a boy and kept and broken again in ways no one had accounted for. "Night gathers," he said, and the words came with the rhythm of blood. "And now my watch begins." He had said these words in a hall that was not this one, in a life that had been folded away like a cloak. The truth of them did not change because he had fallen and risen and led men. They were words that meant something here. He said the whole of them, with breath and with the feeling that he was not speaking alone. When his voice dropped, the wind took the last syllables and licked them like bones. Something moved under the earth. Jon did not start. The Nightfort did nothing quickly. He waited. The movement was not the well. It was the other thing under the keep. The thing that had been carved and coaxed and sung into the stone when the Night's Watch had more men than the North had farmers. He went down. The stair to the black gate was ribbed with ice. 2 torches were not enough and were too much. Their light turned the frost into 1,000 vicious edges and made the dark look sulky with withheld truths. At the bottom of the passage the gate waited. It was a weirwood door, its grain living and pale, and a face had been coaxed out of that grain with the patient cruelty of a craftsman in love with quiet things. The mouth hung open as if in sleep. The eyes were closed. Jon stood before it and spoke again the oath. The air in the passage was dead. It woke when the door did. The eyes opened the way ice cracks when a thaw is sudden, a long, reluctant parting. The breath that came out was old leaves crushed to powder. "Who comes?" the door asked him, voice as dry as winter wood splitting. "A man of the Night's Watch," he said. "Who comes?" The door asked again, more impatient with ritual than with men. "Jon Snow," he said, because he had been taught once that names are the safest lies to tell. "What is it you would have?" asked the door. "I would have passage for one who would bind wounds," Jon said. "I would know if men have come to your mouth with false words. I would know if any man who called himself sworn has spoken to you with hate in him. I know vows," the door whispered, patient now. "I know when they are meat in the mouth and when they are bone. A man came 2 nights past." He spoke the words and the words slept in him as if they had only just been laid down. He came with his hands blood-soured and fear sweat under his arms. He lied. He made the old sound new to trick an old ear. He did not cross. I did not open. Jon let the thread of breath he had been holding out into the cold. He sought to bring others through. He sought to bring none through. He sought to talk to a dead tree and I did not answer. He was like a boy in a pawnshop with nothing to trade but his own name. "Could you see him?" "I see wood," the door said, not unkind. "You must see men." Jon inclined his head as if to a maester. The door closed its eyes with a sound like a man who has finally been allowed to go to sleep after a long day. Jon turned back, torch a rude gold, and climbed up. He sent men quietly to watch the old lower ways where the Nightfort had grown like a fungus into the ice. He told no one what the gate had said. He told them instead what the hall needed to hear, that the gods were listening, and that the living would do their part to make the listening worth something. He had hoped to keep the fire pointed inward for a day, and instead he found himself putting out sparks in every corner. A thorn-born knight who had come with the Serwins caught a then boy trying to lift a dagger from his belt, and would have flayed the boy with words had Jon not stepped between. The boy had eyes like a deer. The knight had a mouth like a trap. "You've come to be safe," Jon said to the boy, letting him meet his gaze. "We have asked you to come as a guest. Be one. You don't have to like a man to deny yourself the satisfaction of cutting his throat. Where I come from, the boy muttered. You take what you can hold. Where you are now, you hold your tongue and your temper both. You speak like a man with a rope around his waist, the boy said. I am tied to this place as surely as any man ever was, Jon said. But I tied the knot myself. By the time dusk stuck its fingers into the crucibles of fire lit along the parapets, men had remembered how to talk to each other. The hall found a pitch again. They ate without looking over their shoulders, and when they spoke of Bannon Crowell they did so in the way men speak of men they liked for their laughter more than for their prowess. They told his small stories. They left out the arrow. Val came with the dusk, white fur thrown about shoulders that had seen more cold than comfort. She had a way of standing that made it seem as if she were a part of the landscape rather than a person crossing it. Still, but like a tree is still, ready to bend and whip as the wind wills. She did not smile much. When she did, the room warmed the way the first patch of sunlight does in leafless woods. You're making a town out of a tale, she said by way of greeting. What does a town need first? I forget. Water, Jon said, thinking of the well that was not a well. And laws that fit like boots. Some men have bigger feet than others. Then we make law like a bootmaker, Jon said, surprising himself. We measure and cut and don't sell the same shoe to every foot. Val rolled her shoulders. Kneelers and free people both wearing your boots, now that I would watch. Stay and watch it, then. Help me keep them from tripping. Why would I? Her eyes held mischief. There was sharpness in it, but it was kind. Because you told me once the world you wanted had doors that were open. Because you sing better than I do when the mood needs lifting. Because Tormund listens to you when he does not listen to me. He listens to me when I speak the words he was already thinking, she said. As do you, when you wish to think you've changed your mind and have not. I listen because you are not afraid to tell me when I am wrong. Val's mouth did not smile, but her eyes did. You are wrong a great deal. I know. It should have rung a bell or a blade when she arrived, because that is the way of stories. A woman walking in at dusk carries a warning sewn into her cloak. It did not. There was too much to watch and too many men who thought their knives would slice more easily if no one noticed them being sharpened. The pact was to be the next day. They had given it other names around the hall as the notion grew its own flesh. The making of the night's peace. The new guesting. The thing of the true north. Jon thought all the names too grand and so called it only the thing that needed doing. The act would be simple. The free folk and the northern lords would gather beneath the heart tree. Bread and salt would be shared in the godswood. Then in the hall they would speak the limits of the gift and the opening of the market below the wall, the rules of justice and the names of the men and women who would sit in judgment when need arose. One from each of the old clans and one from each of the free folk bands and two chosen by lot from among those who had been resident a year and a day. No man could be held in the hall who had not taken bread and salt there. No frame of wood would be raised on the south side without an equal on the north, and vice versa. When a child was born of a marriage from either side, they would be presented to the tree, and if the parents would, to the seven in some other hall, and if not, then to the wind. Jon had thought hard about the old ways and what could be kept and what must be left behind like a skin that did not fit. He had thought harder about the rules of violence and of care. The night's watch, such as it was, would not police men's meals. It would keep to the wall. But the hall would demand respect from whoever sat within it, and the penalties for breaking that respect would be known. He had a list of those punishments in his mind and another written in a clerk's crabbed hand in manderly ink on a page that smelled of the sea. The trap set for that day was not of Jon's making, nor was it wholly built by the men who fell into it. It was older. Men only used it as the step they had forgotten they would trip on. The bread was baked in the ovens that had tasted thousands of dinners and half as many disasters. The salt was poured by a manderly cook with hands that had never shaken over a cask of anything. Yet somewhere between oven and table someone had found means to sprinkle death. Jon's first knowledge of it was not the way his tongue felt, nor was it the way his stomach clenched when he saw one of the then elders go gray under his skin. It was Ghost. The dire wolf lifted his head from under the table where he had been sleeping away boredom and and put his nose to the air and growled. It was not the music of warning. It was disgust. The then elder sagged before anyone else moved. Men shouted. Val swore in a language older than the hall. The elder's eyes rolled like marbles in the dark. Jon pushed the man's jaw open and smelled bitter almonds. He said a word that was not a prayer and took the cup from the elder's hand and sniffed that too. The poison was not in the ale. Salt, he snapped. Down your throats with water. Spill what's in your mouths. He threw the elder's cup away and knocked the salt cellar off the table and crushed it under his boot. No one eat. No one touched the bread. A dozen men had already done both. Vomit spattered the floor like a new kind of rain. Wyman Manderley's cook was on her knees with a copper pin between her fingers and a dose of milk of the poppy clenched in her hand. She moved among the fallen like water. Others gathered to help, not asking whom they helped because there was no time. The hall found something like its better self in that moment, because there are times when hatred is a luxury. The man who had sprinkled the salt must have been beside himself. If he had taken it from the cellar at all, he had not counted on Ghost. He had not counted on a hall that had already broken its food into the mouths of its enemies and so would be careful of them. They saved most. The elder died because someone must, if a tale is to have a shape. He died hard because this was the North, and because the men who poisoned and those who took the poison had all believed in their own causes. The hall sat stunned, then furious. Guessed right, the Manderley cook said in a voice like a blade laid on an anvil. You try to break it in my kitchen? You try to lay the shadow of it on my salt? Whoever you are, I hope your mother never has another morning. The then Magner's mouth thinned. His voice had the chill of glacier water. This is a blood debt. No, Jon said. He was on his feet with the sense that he had been so for hours. This is a question, and the answer is not knives. Not here. Outside with it if you must. But we will ask the tree first, as I swore we would. You swore? Someone snarled. As a crow. I swore as a man, Jon said. Listen to me. This was neat work done by hands that thought us fools. The salt came from Manderley's casks. The salt was pure when we poured it. You saw it. You tasted it. The poison dusted the top between the cellar and the table. Whose hand carried it? Whose? Tormund snarled. I will take his fingers and feed them to him. You may yet, Jon said, but we will fetch him honest. He sent Ghost out into the hall and then into the dark beyond the door and lifted his hand when men rose to follow. Ghost did not need feet clattering behind him. Ghost needed only his nose. The direwolf slid over flagstones, through the kitchens, to the door in the rubble where the frost had been smeared by iron and the grit had bit Jon's hand. He put his nose there and then shouldered at the stones until one shifted with a complaint loud enough to wake the dead if the dead had chosen to stir. Here, Jon said, voice flat. Men came with crowbars and curses and levered a block out. Behind the block was a crawl space no man would have chosen. Men chose it anyway when they needed to move where others could not. Ghost shoved and jammed and slithered like an eel, and when the passage widened he bounded and vanished. They found the man in the lower passage, cramped between a buttress and a long run of bone-white roots that had eaten stone with quiet greed for a century. He had a knife in his hand and a black cloak about him. The cloak meant nothing and everything. It had once meant brother. Here and now it meant the first idea a liar had to hand. I know you, Glover said, tilting his head. Harith, builder's boy out of Eastwatch. You went missing after a fight with a fisherman who claimed you'd taken his hooks. I went where a man could look a king in the eye and not be told his glance was a debt, Harith said. His face was full of the righteousness that makes men do ridiculous things. He would have died anyway, then. He was a beast who had never taken a knee to anyone. Better under the roof of the Nightfort than in the open like a dog. You powdered salt, Jon said. Like a cook who had watched a woman with calloused hands and a child on her hip do it and thought you could make the motion with the same grace. The man's eyes jumped, nervous rabbits. I did what no one would speak for, he spat. His spit hung in the cold like a curse. You feed wolves at your table and call it peace. The wolves have come to the table before, Jon said, voice very soft. They are better when they eat from a bowl than from a thigh. Men die either way, Hareth said with a grimness he fancied brave. The watch is for men who know that truth. You are not of the watch now, Jon said. The shard of iron in his glove pocket felt hot, though it was only a memory of warmth against his thigh. You went to the gate and tried to awake it with words you had used like tools your whole life. You lied to an old door. You carried poison under a cloak you did not deserve to wear and sprinkled it in a hall you had not been invited into. You did not break guest right. You tried to make us break it with our own hands. Hareth looked at him with a strange pity. You will make a good lord, he said. You will parse the difference between sins until your tongue is a sieve. He shifted his knife and leaned as if he could shove himself through the root. You think you can bind men with bread and salt and things said under a tree. You cannot. Men are stone, Lord Snow. They do not bend without breaking. Then we will choose what breaks, Jon said. Hareth tried to stab him, because the stories demand that men who speak harder than their hearts must answer with steel. Ghost took him in the wrist and shook once. The knife went spinning. Hareth screamed. It came out as a wet sound in the small space. Men pulled him out, crying at the pain more than at the shame, because he believed in his righteousness and in his cause. That made him more dangerous, not less. They bound him and brought him to the hall. They put him before the weirwood with blood on his fingers and a hand that already swelled like a yeast loaf. The judgment was not swift because nothing of worth is. There were those who wanted to hang him from the wall with his own cloak, and those who wanted to give him to the thens, and those who wanted to cut his nose off and tell him to smell only himself thereafter. Jon let them talk. He watched their eyes more than he heard their words. He watched the Manderly cook look at the man with a contempt that turned the skin around her mouth white. He watched Val weighing not the life in front of her but the example it would set. He watched the Magner who would not look at the thief at all. The tree listened. In the end Jon did what he had promised. He took Hareth to the weirwood and laid his hands on the roots and spoke not to the gods, because he did not know whether they cared for such petitions, but to the old stories. He asked the question he had promised to ask. He chose not because the tree answered him in words, but because the hush that fell over the hall in that moment made men remember what they were capable of and what they feared to be. Hareth of Eastwatch, Jon said, voice steady. You have attempted to break guest right by cunning. You took a trust and sought to turn it into a blade we would hold against our own throats. You have taken a life. I am not the watch. I am not a king. I am the man who convened this hall. I do not have the right to hold your life or let it go without the consent of the voices gathered here. I ask for it. Men are not quick to grant authority. They are quicker when they need somewhere to put their fear. In that hall they gave it to him because otherwise they would have had to give it to someone with colder hands. Jon raised his eyes and found Val's. She gave him the tiniest nod, and Tormund did not speak at all, which was consent of a kind. Wylus Manderly had tears in his eyes and would later deny it but did not deny it in his face. The Magner lifted his chin. It was permission to do justice among men. The penalty was old. The North knows what to do with men who have broken a house. Jon took up Longclaw. The sword's weight was not so great. The weight was in the simple fact of steel and in the way the hall breathed. Hareth did not plead. He looked at Jon with a kind of sad hunger, as if this too was proof he had been right. Jon did not look away. He said the words the Stark men had taught him to say and made the cut clean. The sound the sword made was the sound steel makes when it goes through anything, a whisper and a ringing note that belonged to neither air nor bone. Hareth's blood steamed where it hit snow. The hall did not cheer. It did not exult. It did something better. It remembered. After they had carried Hareth away and after the Manderly cook had scrubbed the salt cellar until it shone and after the thens had taken their elder to the godswood and sung in a language that had a smoke taste to it, the hall sat and breathed as one thing again. Jon set his hand on the table and struck it twice with his knuckles. We begin again, he said. They broke bread and salt in the godswood. The ceremony had the stilted feel that comes when men and women are putting their fear into a thing old enough to carry it. Jon watched the bread go from hand to hand. He watched the salt touch to the lips of men who would never have lain in the same camp before this day. He watched the shadows stir as if the old gods were adjusting themselves on their routes to see better. The cold went through him in a way that felt clean. When they went into the hall, they spoke the terms. The new gift would be opened in parcels to those who wished to work it, free folk or kneeler, by lots drawn in the hall, overseen by a board of strange bedfellows. Robert Glover, Wylas Manderley, the Magner of then, and Alisane Flint, who spoke seldom but whose words sat where they fell. The watch would keep the wall and keep to its own laws. It would be welcome in the hall and unarmed there like any man. Crimes done under the roof would be judged by the hall's chosen. Crimes done under no roof would be judged by those whose land the crime had been done on, with a call to the hall if the accused or accuser demanded it. Children born of mixed union would be presented to the gods under both trees if their parents wished it, and to none if they did not. No one would be forced to kneel for any vow not their own. Oaths would be made carefully and kept fiercely. They needed a coin because men need weights as much as laws. Manderley's shipwright laughed and hammered a die while the talks went on because his hands could not be still when faces were busy. The first coin struck there in the Nightfort had a dire wolf on one face with a crown of snowflakes and a mammoth on the other with a cord about its tusks to show it was bound as men bind beasts. Not cruelly, but with respect. They called it the knight's coin. Passed hands and was a thing no one had had the day before. It had weight. Men weighed it and thought perhaps they had weight too. There was more. There would always be more. You cannot build a new house without finding mice in the old. There were raids after that, small and mean as a fox, more test than hunger. There were arguments about where a fence should lie and whose cow had trespassed and whether the thin boy who stole sausages had meant to shame a house by doing it. There was a winter longer and deeper than rumor had promised. Men and women with names Jon never learned died in it. The Nightfort groaned and hissed and settled her shoulders in. The hall warmed. The weirwood lost leaves and grew them again. Ghost grew scars on his nose from fights he had chosen and fights he had not. Jon learned to stand in a hall where Val and Wylas and the Magner and Glover could shout and not draw steel. He learned to count casks and watch fires. He learned, more than anything, when to admit he had not thought of everything. He was good at that. He had practice. Months later, how many, the seasons had made slippery. Bran came to the Nightfort, but not as a boy. He came like wind under the door, like a raven that landed on the weirwood and did not stop being a bird when it looked like a boy it had once been. He came in Jon's dreams and in his waking, leaning his chin on his hands the way he had when he had been small and the world had been the size of an archery butts. He said nothing in words and everything in feeling. I see you. The roots are drinking this. Keep going. This is not the last winter, but it is the winter you can hold. Jon did not wake and tell anyone that. He woke and fed Ghost and went to the hall and settled a quarrel about the market stall where a woman sold tallow dipped with rosemary and a man sold traps. He was still doing that when a summer came and laid a finger on the air and made men remember what grass is for. The hall acquired children the way a river acquires songs. Slowly, then all at once, and then you cannot yourself remember a time when they were not there. A then girl with hair like a tinderbox flame laughed with a flint boy with ears like sails. They ran past the Manderley cook and took bread only with permission and folded their fingers over the new coins and bit them when they thought no one was watching. A boy from the milk-water with a rabbit belt of his own came to the weirwood and put a hand on the face and whispered that he would not steal unless the meat was going to rot anyway. The tree made no sound, but the boy kept the promise to himself and found it fit him like a boot made by his own father. Tormund grew older and fussed about it loudly. He did not slow much. Sometimes he sat long and stared at the wall while his beard iced. He told stories that were not strictly true and did not bother to make them so. Ghost would come and lay his head on Tormund's boot. The old man scratched him and called him a cat. Val had a room in the keep that looked north because she said no one else wished to look at that view when winter was in. She put flowers there in season and dried marrow bones there and kept a spear by the door like a pet she would not let in. She went out when she wanted and came back when it pleased her, and to most of the hall she was a mystery. To John she was the person he sought when he had thought himself into a corner and needed a comment shaped like a knife to cut him out of it. Sometimes he did not need words, and she did not give them. Glover went home to his wife and came back to the hall with a boy he had stolen from hunger. He put the boy to work counting casks. The boy learned to count coins. He made change with his tongue between his teeth and a look of fierce concentration that made Wiles laugh, and then gave the old shipwright something new to teach. How to cut dies, how to set the strike, how to make a face appear in metal that matched a drawing only in the parts that mattered. The thens never smiled. They did laugh, though, sometimes when the fire was low and they were warm and no one else was listening. They laughed like men who had been given a thing they did not recognize in daylight. Space between what they were and what they might be. The Night's Watch sent a party from Castle Black with a letter that had been written in a hand John could have found in a room by darkness alone. The hand was the sort that made letters look like tools meant to fix barn doors or take them off their hinges. It was the hand of a steward whose pride had been battered and was wary of being put in a place where it could be bruised again. The letter congratulated the hall on remembering what a roof was for. It declined an invitation to sit in judgment because the watch was old and had its own business. It sent two brothers with their cheeks still glossy from youth to sit in the back and learn to listen. It advised no one on anything. That was a kindness and a mercy. John took it as such. When the second winter came, and they call it the second because in the north we count winters like we count teeth missing, the Nightfort did not eat anyone who did not want to be eaten. The hall held. Men did stupid things because men do, but they did fewer of them because the cost of doing them was counted by eyes that did not hate them. A woman in from the rills cudgeled her husband out of a fight with a then over whether the then had looked at her too long. The husband, bloody-nosed, called her the best of the old gods and meant it. The then went home and tried to teach his own wife the cudgel's use, and she rolled her eyes and told him she had taught him that already. Perhaps there were moments when John thought of Winterfell and of a hall with old banners and a lord's chair his father had filled with a kind of quiet that made men want to be good. Perhaps John sat alone in the kitchens, sometimes with the lid of the well making a drum under his boots, and thought of another life where he would have broken bread under different shadows. He did not speak of it. He had chosen his shadow. It was the only one that could sit under the wall and not be shamed by it. Once, as spring was proving itself more than a liar, a raven came from the south so tired its wings were like torn parchment. It flapped into the Nightfort and fell like a stone and lay in a pool of sun on the floor. It had a ring on its leg like a lord. John took the ring and the paper. The seal was of wax green as the sea. It had no message in it that mattered, because the true message was in the bird itself. The roads had thought enough to carry gossip north. White Harbor had a rumor of a king with an iron crown who had died by a cup. Old Town had burned a library by accident and saved every book that mattered. A fair had been set near Barrowton where men had juggled with knives that had handles of bone and blades of light. John read the broken lines and passed the paper to Wiles, and he to Val and she to the Magner. They smiled in their different ways. What do we care for kings and fairs? Tormund asked, though he knew very well that the hall was a fair of its own, and that men make kings out of any man willing to take decisions no one else will. We care that there are worlds where the wall is a tale told by men who have never felt a wind that cuts straight to bone, Wiles said. And we care that our tale is not just a black stone with snow on it. I claim it first then, Tormund said, thumping a hand on the table. The first fair of the Nightfort. No king. Free entry. Anyone who cheats at dice will have his beard singed. Beards first, then fingers, the Manderley cook said. Only if they try it again, Tormund added, magnanimous as a man with a full belly. We'll roast a mammoth. We'll roast two. You'll roast what you can catch. I will catch anything that does not have a mind to be caught. They held the fair. Men came because men come to warmth and to gossip and to a chance to show they can throw 3 knives in a row without cutting off their own ears. Women came with wares and with babies and with calm. A giant danced with a fisher girl from Long Lake and the floor held because it had learned to. The thens watched and did not scowl the whole time. The Magner owned a laugh for the space of a breath and looked as if the act had hurt him and then made him proud of the hurt. John stood at the edge of the room and let himself be a man at a fair. He did not solve any dispute. He did not judge any crimes. He leaned against a post and let his mouth catch up with his thoughts. Val came and leaned against the same post, and they did not speak for a long time. "You made a roof," she said at last. "I thought you would make a law. You made a roof instead." "Roofs hold better than laws if the rafters are right," Jon said. "And your rafters are men and women who have decided that heat is a better use of wood than war." She made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had had any less weariness in it. "Do you never tire of making it sound like the simplest thing in the world to be decent?" "Every day," Jon said. "I do it anyway." Val watched the room a moment longer, then turned her head to look at him in a way that made the background everydayness of noise and food and laughter feel like a wall of its own. "When you go," she said. "North. Anywhere," she said. "When you go, you will leave this roof. Do you trust it to stand without you?" Jon's hand went to Ghost's head. The direwolf's fur was clean and smelled like snow. "No roof is a man," he said. "It stands because of beams and braces, and because everyone sleeping under it trusts everyone else to wake when they smell smoke. Ghost might smell it first. If he doesn't, someone's baby will cry. Wylus will curse because of the noise. Tormund will talk too loud, and that will make the fire embarrassed, and it will die down for shame." Val shook her head for show. "You are a fool," she said. "I am, and I am right." Later, when he stood again on the parapet with the wind nosing under his collar and Ghost leaning against his knee, Jon imagined the Nightfort as a thing alive in a way a castle has no right to be. He imagined it as a house of lungs, the kitchens and the hall inhaling and exhaling. He imagined the gods would listening because it had been loved in a way that had nothing of fear in it and everything of respect. He imagined a boy from the Milkwater counting coins with his tongue and plotting how to make more of them without grinding anyone down, and a then girl laughing when she realized that the flint-haired boy she liked would be proud of her for beating him at throwing knives instead of shamed. He imagined Wylus writing to his father and having the round man laugh and puff and send yet another cask because joy is difficult to resist when it sits by a fire and tells you you helped make it. He imagined Tormund forgetting that he was old because no one had told him he was and because no one would dare. The wind did not soften. It rarely did. But there was a different thing in it. A tone he had not heard before, as if the air itself had learned a new word. He did not know if it was peace. He did not know that there is any single word for it. It was quieter than that, more stubborn. It was the sound stones make when they settle into a wall properly built. It was the sigh a beam gives when the weight it carries is what it was meant for. Ghost made that chuff again that meant nothing and everything at once. Jon put his hand on the direwolf's back and inhaled. The Nightfort breathed with him. The world north and south stood where it was. For a time, that most precious of measures, it was enough.